Welcome. I'm Michelle Novello, Program Coordinator for Providence Community Library. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're proud to host the third and final presentation of this important series entitled Power, Privilege, and Social Justice, the History of African American Civil Rights in Providence, Rhode Island. We're grateful to our sponsor, Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, and for our valued partnership with Rhode Island Black Storytellers and Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. This hour-long event begins with a short story by Valerie Tutson, then a 45-minute presentation by Keith Stokes, followed by a short Q&A. So please know that all in attendance will be muted, and we ask you to keep your video off to enhance your viewing experience and everyone else's. Also, you're encouraged to send us questions throughout the lecture on chat, and we'll answer what we can during the Q&A. We ask that you take 1 to 2 minutes to fill out a brief survey, which we will email you tomorrow. Your feedback is reported to our sponsors who allow us to offer programs like this for free. So it's really important that you take the 1 or 2 minutes to do that. Your feedback also helps us know what you want in the future and any suggestions to make our programs better. In that email, you will also get links to tonight's recording, along with links to valuable resources compiled by our library staff regarding this topic. So it is now my privilege to introduce you to a longtime supporter of our libraries, Valerie Tutson. She is remarkable in the scope of her reach within Rhode Island and around the world as an extraordinary storyteller and teacher. She has been a featured performer on national and international stages since 1991 and is a founding member and executive director of Rhode Island Black Storytellers. She has received countless awards, including the Public Humanities Scholar Award from Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, the 2019 Pell Award for Excellence in the Arts from Trinity Rep Company, and an honorary doctorate of fine arts from Rhode Island College. I'm honored to present to you Valerie Tutson.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and it is a pleasure for me to be here with you all this evening, live as in person as possible. And just so you know, Michelle, you might not even know this, but my storytelling started in the libraries right in the city of Providence. That's where I began my work here. So it is wonderful to be a part of this. And I know that we are coming to the end of this part of the series, and we're talking about civil rights and we're talking about movements, and that's a generational thing. So it made me think about this particular story, which is a folk tale, if you will, and it's one that I heard in the State House of Rhode Island at one of some many millions of rallies that I've been to over the years. But the message of it has never left me. And so I wanted to share this story with everyone tonight, like this. Once, a long time ago, there was a family that decided they wanted to go fishing. Now, when I say family, what I mean by that is the parents, the children, and the grandparents all decided they were going to make their way down to the lake to go fishing. And when they got down to the lake, this was not a teeny tiny lake. This was a great big lake. You couldn't even see the other side. And right there on the shore, there were 2 boats. One boat for the parents and one boat for the grandparents. And before they got into their boats, they turned to the children and they said, we're going to leave you right here on the shore and have yourselves a good time, but be very careful. Stay awake, don't fall asleep, and keep your eyes and ears open. If you are not careful, the wild animals will come right out of the bushes over there and they will eat you up. Now, of course, when the children heard that, at first they laughed a little bit, although they did know that there were animals nearby. There were even hippos right there near that water, but still they nodded their heads and said goodbye to their parents, waved them off as they got out into the boat. And the parents and grandparents went away from the shore, and the children played right there beside the water for a long time, most of the day. And you can imagine that after a while, they did get a bit sleepy. And so they laid out on the sand, and it wasn't long before they fell asleep. And around the time that the children fell asleep, the whole atmosphere changed. The sun went away and the cloud cover came in. And pretty soon the rain started to fall and the wind started to blow. The boats were struggling to move up and down and through the waves. And the parents and grandparents decided it was time for them to turn their way back to the shore. And when they did, they turned and they looked, and they saw that the children were asleep. And not only did they see that the children were sleeping, but they could see, making its way out of the bush, a lion coming closer and closer to the children, moving very slowly. Now, when the parents saw that, they started to row as fast as they could, but they couldn't make any headway against the wind, and the waves kept pushing them back. They were straining and straining and straining, but there was no way they were going to get to the shore. The grandparents watched this whole thing going on, and they called to the parents, "Stop it. Stop it. You will never be able to make it back to the shore. Stop trying to get back to the children. We must raise our voices. We must yell and scream and wake the children up. Then they will be able to save themselves." And so the parents and the grandparents raised their voices and yelled and screamed. And the children, they woke and saved themselves.
Thank you, Valerie. That is an awesome story. You're awesome. I now have the privilege of introducing our presenter, Keith Stokes. Keith is widely known and respected for his extensive knowledge and tireless research on topics such as tonight. And he has received numerous awards for his work, including the Rhode Island Small Business Advocate of the Year Award, and along with his wife, Teresa Stokes, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities Prize for Creative Achievements in the Humanities. Keith is a frequent lecturer both nationally and locally, and with an expertise in early African and Jewish American history. He has served on numerous regional and national historic preservation boards and appears on national historic programs including C-SPAN, Fox News, Legend and Lies, and TED Talk. Keith, we're so honored to host you tonight. Thank you for sharing with us your research and knowledge in this presentation. It's all yours.
Thank you, Michelle, and particularly thank you, the Providence Community Libraries, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and my great friend, Valerie and the Rhode Island Black Storytellers. It's wonderful to follow Valerie and her passion and her history. Today, which is the third part, is titled Ongoing Struggle, and it begins to touch on the surface of the evidentiary documentation we've been able to uncover and interpret to begin to have us all have a better understanding on the history of civil rights within the African American community of Providence and all of Rhode Island. This program runs about 45 minutes. It's a lot of information in a relatively short period of time, but as Michelle said, please, if you have questions and comments, if you can't get online, then certainly we have a last slide that has access to emails and information. And we look forward to answering any information and providing any information to the audience. It's important for me to recognize that this research for this presentation has been the contributions of a number of institutions and libraries in Rhode Island. And I can't tell you how fortunate we are to have some of the deepest, some of the most diverse records on early African and African American history and all across the country, right here in Providence and right here in Rhode Island. So many of the images that you see are items that we've been able to obtain and digitize and use on behalf of these outstanding organizations and institutions. And I just urge you, if you have the time, visit these organizations, support these institutions, and particularly support Providence Community Library. The first two presentations began to talk about civil rights in African American community from the perspective of the early arrivals from enslavement to emancipation and freedom in the 18th and early 19th century. Last week, we presented the 19th century circumstance where there was a real fight for basic rights of education, voting rights, living rights. And what we also learned is by the end of the 19th century, probably one of the most demeaning events was the 1896 Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, which made the historic decision that separate but equal facilities would satisfy the 14th Amendment, thus really legitimizing and expanding Jim Crow segregation laws. So by the beginning of the 20th century, much of our discussion today is the African-American community, their institutions, their allies, combating literally head-on the Southern traditions of Jim Crow, but also the traditions of Jim Crow that are now seeping into Rhode Island, in New England, and across the country, and what we call today, this presentation, the ongoing struggle. Now, this presentation will be separated into three compact parts. The first, which we call the World War I years and the fighting overseas and at home, and the evolution of some of the earliest African-American men and women, political and civil rights and social justice organizations. The second part we're going to call the World War II years, which really focuses on fair employment policies and access to particularly federal jobs and federal investments that are tied to the World War II effort. And then the third and final part is called Fair Housing and Urban Redevelopment and Our Fair Share, and the significant impact in the mid-late 20th century of fair housing, public housing, urban redevelopment activities within specific neighborhoods of Providence, but particularly within certain communities. So the first part, which is the World War I era, begins with the fighting the Jim Crow traditions at home. And what we find is that in the 20th century begins, the early part of the 20th century, African heritage men and women are now very much organizing around and creating formal equal rights, civil rights organizations. And in Providence, you see organizations such as the Charles Summer Political Club, a Rhode Island chapter of the Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which is a part of a national network, the Marathon Club, the Progressive Literary Society. These progressive literary societies were going on in Black enclaves in all the major cities in America, which really sought to ensure that the education and the literacy of the African-American community was directly tied with their ability to recognize the importance of voting and the importance of standing for themselves and articulating themselves before government. And then also, most importantly, you have the establishments of a Providence Urban League by 1939 and the Providence branch of the NAACP in 1913. And these new early 20th century civil rights leaders in Providence are some of the most dynamic men and women, which unfortunately are largely unknown today, but hopefully by the end of this presentation will be known by this audience. And it's men and women such as John Minkins, Mary Jackson, Joseph LeCount, Aaron Heathman, Roberta Dunbar, John Hope, and Dr. William and Bertha Higgins. I want to start with the Providence NAACP because it's one of the earlier branches that is established after the national branch is established in 1909. The Providence branch is established after a mass meeting that included over 400 people, Black and white, at a benefit congregational church in Providence. And at this mass meeting, it was agreed that there would be a Providence branch be organized, and the founding members included Dr. Julius Robinson, Reverend Elaine, Roberta Dunbar, and John Minkins, who I'll talk about in detail, William Heathman, James Dixon, and William P.H. Freeman, who was an active African-American realtor who was buying property and renting property to African-Americans across the city at that time. In the centerpiece of this particular slide, you actually get to see from the collections of Rhode Island Black Heritage Society an early membership drive 100 years ago in April 15th of 1920, where the Providence branch of the NAACP has as their featured speaker W.E.B. Du Bois as a way of raising consciousness and raising funds and membership for the fledgling organization. I also want to point out that the NAACP's leadership and involvement in Rhode Island is quite extensive, and its connectivity to the national office is also extensive. This is an interesting slide for me because it provides a very interesting aspect that the Spingarn Award, which is a medal given each year by the NAACP nationally for a person of African descent of outstanding community achievement. In 1918, the national award was presented at the First Baptist Church in Providence to William Stanley Braithwaite for distinguished achievements in literature and poetry. Dr. Braithwaite at that time was a professor at Atlanta University, one of the earliest Black poets, and literary agents, and was renowned across the country for his work at that time. Later, by the 1920s, he's in Harlem, and he's leading the Harlem Renaissance effort in promoting and publishing poets and literary. What's most important about Braithwaite is that he's born in Boston, but he summers both in Providence and Newport, and he's actively engaged in both communities in expanding literary and political events. On this slide is not only a great image of Dr. Braithwaite, but we have an image from my family collection from an event in 1902 that includes Providence and Newport prominent men who are having a curious discussion, but a topical discussion at that time are the mental capacities of the sexes equal. Now, what's important to recognize is in 1902, significant numbers of civic organizations tended to be segregated by race and sex. But what's most important about this flyer is that William Stanley Braithwaite is the chairman in leading this discussion. What's important to me and what I would share to you is my own grandfather and great uncle are a part of this forum. And I can tell you, both my grandmother and great aunt were college educated. So at least my grandfather and great uncle, if they were going home that night, they had the answer to that question. But it's really the fight overseas and at home that begins to take root in the early 20th century and really moving into the World War I era. The World War I era is a transformative period for America, not only because of the war that we would eventually and rather late enter, but by the fact of those years leading up to the war, there's a significant migration effort going on. In fact, nearly 2 million African Americans who are escaping the brutal sharecrop system and Jim Crow system in the American South are now migrating and relocating into urban cities across the North and the Midwest. In fact, we see significant numbers of Southern African Americans relocating to places like Providence, and they're landing in neighborhoods like Lipid Hill, Fox Point, and College Hill area. They're also seeing large numbers entered into Pawtucket and into Newport. At that same time, we also see as World War I is moving forward, there's a significant opportunity for African Americans to further enhance their American citizenship and their contributions to this country through their service in the war effort. We now know that over 350,000 African American men and women participated in military service during that World War. And in fact, one of the most significant persons of Rhode Island at that time in leading the war effort, not overseas on the battlefront, but on the battlefronts of social justice, equality for women, and equality for African Americans, is Mary Elizabeth Jackson of Providence. Mary Elizabeth Jackson of Providence is a Renaissance woman. Her home still stands on Willard Avenue, but most importantly, we have significant information about this woman. We know that she's born in 1867 in Providence. She's a proud lifelong member of the Pond Street Baptist Church, and she's one of the founding charter members of the Providence NAACP. What's most important about her life and her contributions is that during the outbreak of World War I, she's already established Rhode Island through the old Department of Labor as a statistician. And her focus and expertise is on the work and the employment and the training requirements for colored or African American women at that time. She also is recruited by the YWCA War Work Council to help analyze national trends in promoting and encouraging fair employment for all women, but particularly women of color. Mary Elizabeth Jackson is a giant nationally and within Rhode Island in the promotion of fair, equal wages and opportunities for all women, and particularly women of color. She writes a series of pieces in the National Crisis magazine and the NAACP and other magazines, but in one crisis magazine, she specifically states, and I will read, "Thousands and thousands of eager boys have gone to France. We all know about them. Few of us realize that at the same time, an army of women is entering the mills, the factories, and all branches of industry. We should support them. We should embrace them." And for the work of Mary Elizabeth Jackson, I can't tell you how important this is, because a theme that you'll continue to hear tonight in this presentation is even though we are not the brutal segregation and Jim Crow policies of the American South, there is significant Jim Crow traditions that creep into New England and are well situated in Rhode Island. One that we find is the Jim Crow tradition of not enabling and allowing African American men and women equal share to employment. In 1918, as America enters the World War, and there is a peak for demand of manufacturing, we now see our industrial manufacturing facilities, Rhode Island, transitioning into tanks, planes, and armaments to support the troops. The Gorham Manufacturing Company, the old plant that would have been on Elmwood Avenue in South Providence, moved from making jewelry to making hand grenade parts, and they hired an entirely female labor force. At the time, the NAACP and other leaders had requested that women of color should also have this opportunity, but consistently they were denied this position to the degree where when the owners of the company were asked why, they simply stated that white women refused to work side by side by colored women. It would not create and support a productive work environment. The NAACP made this a national issue. It became national news on at least African-American newspapers, but most importantly, they would petition the governor at that time who would intercede, and eventually African-American women would have equal access to employment, not only at Gorham, but of manufacturing across the state. But it's really the data and the factual evidence that is established by women such as Mary Elizabeth Jackson that would document and that would support and encourage this opportunity of access. And it's between the war years after World War I that's important because there's a significant transition going on. By the end of World War I, even though it's a short period of time of America's participation, we are successful. And W.E.B. Du Bois himself in the NAACP magazine would proclaim in November of 1918, we return from fighting, make way for democracy. So as African-American troops were returning in 1918 and into 1919, their expectation was, we have yet fought and bled yet again for our country. We deserve full access and full benefits to being citizens in the state of Rhode Island and the United States as any citizen. But in the summer of 1919, there is a significant pushback. This pushback today is recognized by historians as the Red Summer. The Red Summer meeting, there were over 100 race riots in every major city in America, all connected to returning African-American soldiers and also the push for African-Americans to have equal access to jobs, to housing, and living opportunity. And one of the great tragedies during this Red Summer is during the peak of lynching of African-Americans that well surpassed the late 19th century lynchings. And in many cases, we have African-American veterans who were lynched while still in uniform. And possibly one of the most horrendous riots of that time, the following year, is the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riot. And by the mid-1920s, the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, is growing across the country and would reach its peak of 4 million paid members. In Rhode Island alone, by 1925, there are several thousand active dues-paying KKK members. In fact, that year at Rhodes on the Patuxent, the KKK sponsored their first public membership organization event that drew 1,000 people. There are KKK events in what is today Burrillville, Foster, and Gloucester, where they are burning crosses. What's most important to recognize is that the KKK's growth at that time is not only directed at African Americans. In Rhode Island and in New England, it's particularly and also directed at the large growth of immigrant Catholics that arrived. Rhode Island during the early 20th century are welcoming immigrants many who profess the Catholic faith, from French Canadians in Northern Rhode Island to Irish and Italians in the balance of the state. So the KKK was a threat to not only African Americans in Rhode Island, but also those who chose to worship God freely under their own religion. And most importantly, despite this rise of intolerance, this rise of the KKK within our own state, a state that was established under religious toleration and liberty of conscience, people are standing up. Led by the NAACP and other religious organizations, Rhode Island hosts one of the largest silent protest parades in the region. In this parade, which was going on across the country, but in Rhode Island at Providence, this parade led over 1,000 people marching silently throughout the city in the recognition of the violence and the lynchings that were now taking hold in America post-World War I. And because of the challenges of the war effort, the lack of access to education, the lack of access to particularly employment, there's a new group of leaders that are coming about who are forming the NAACP, forming these organizations. Two of the members, two of many that I've been able to document and interpret that I'd like to present today is John Minkins and Roberta Dunbar. John Minkins becomes editor of the Providence Daily Evening News. He is by far at that time the first African heritage editor of a predominantly white-owned newspaper. He also founds his own Black-themed newspapers while living in Pawtucket. He is a founding member of the NAACP, and he becomes a national lecturer on the issues of race relations, and particularly the issues of lynchings and the impact of the violence on the African-American community. Roberta Dunbar, who's born in Narragansett and later relocates to Providence, again, like Mary Elizabeth Jackson, a long-term member of Pond Street Baptist Church, becomes one of the leading members, not only in Rhode Island, but nationally, in the Rhode Island and National Colored Women's Club movement. The Colored Women's Clubs movement is literally an organization that allows and engages educated, activist women of color who could use numbers in organizing, in pushing forth federal, state, and local policy agendas that would benefit women of color, all people of color, and all people. Miss Dunbar was also active in not only the women's clubs, but in working girls clubs in providing assistance and support for young women of all races and colors in Rhode Island. In 1925, she hosted the 22nd annual convention of colored women's clubs in Providence, and you see an image of not only her, but her in the center, in the front center, sitting here in Providence in 1925 for that event. The years during and before and after World War I think we realize it's a challenge as far as equal rights to employment and basic political rights and civil rights. And as these new wave of African-American political right leaders are now evolving in Providence, they're very much embedded politically in the Republican Party. At that time, the Republican Party is still the party of Lincoln. It's the party of emancipation. It's the party of opportunities. And in the 1920s, it's literally a Miss Bertha Higgins, whose husband, Dr. Julius Higgins, becomes an early member of the Ward Committee and a civil rights activist in his own right. She begins to establish what becomes the Julia Ward Howe Republican Women's Club. And the whole intent of this club, and she's organizing and working closely with several African-American churches in Providence, Pond Street, Winter AME, and others, she's really focusing on reaffirming and ensuring the rights of colored citizens of Rhode Island to have equal opportunity before the law and equal political rights. But by the end of the 1920s and the 1930s, you begin to see a dissatisfaction of the African-American community, not only in Providence of Rhode Island, but across the country with the Republican Party. They've been loyal members, loyal voting members. They have supported every major candidate from local to federal, but they haven't received the support in federal appointments, federal jobs, and most importantly, federal legislation such as the anti-lynching legislation that they greatly called for. So by the early 1930s, Bertha Higgins, along with John Lopez, who later becomes a president of the NAACP in Providence, begins the process of breaking away from the Republican Party and beginning to encourage a mass movement from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party of people of color in Providence. And I want to be clear, this is a movement that's going on across the country. And in Rhode Island, it's John Lopez, Bertha Higgins, and others who are young, they're dynamic, they're ready, they're educated, and they're demanding more from their elected officials. And they're particularly demanding that their political parties recognize their importance and their contributions of voting and political support. So that provides you kind of an intro. It just touches the surface of what was going on in the early 20th century in the World War I years. Now I'd like to kind of walk you through what we now call the World War II years, which are again tied to fair employment, particularly because of the massive investments of World War II activities coming on in Rhode Island and the opportunities for tens of thousands of federal subsidized or federally directed work that was made available to support that war effort. And unfortunately, African Americans were still on the outside looking in. And in fact, during the World War II era, we see the largest mobilization of troops and resources in the history of American Rhode Island. In Rhode Island's case, we see large bases and forts being set up in Newport, at Quonset, and even in Providence. In fact, in Providence, the Kaiser Walsh Shipyard which is one of the largest shipyards in the country. It employs over 10,000 workers at one point, welders, pipe fitters, steam fitters, who are building Liberty ships and support ships. And it is all going on in Providence at the Kaiser Shipyard, which today will be located at the Providence and Cranston border along the Johnson and Wales Harbor campus and Save the Bay campus. But by the mid part of the war, by 1943, the African-American community is very concerned with the fact that there's a demand for jobs, good jobs, well-paid jobs, skilled jobs, but African-Americans are still on the outside looking in. And it is now the newly formed Providence Urban League, led by James Williams, and the NAACP, led by Joseph LeCount, who begin to push the state to begin to collect data, and understand the exact circumstances that we know as a Black community that's going on each and every day and forbidding us of having access to fair and gainful employment. In 1943, the state, through a commission that was led by Joseph LeCount and others, was able to assemble a significant amount of data and documentation that they later would create in a report entitled The Report of the Commission of the Employment Problems of Negroes in Rhode Island. This report's major findings concluded that there is widespread unfair discriminatory practices against Negro applicants across all positions within the state, not only federal war-related positions, but private positions. And what's extraordinary about this report, which is a part of the archive, our state archives in Rhode Island, is that it provides detailed first-person documentation and experiences of what people of African-American descent were facing each and every day in Rhode Island, and particularly in our capital city of Providence. As someone who is native born and loves my state and believed I understood history as well as anyone, I was dumbfounded and shocked by reading the first-hand reports of what African men, women, and families were going through each and every day, not in Mississippi, not in South Carolina, but Providence, Newport, and Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And some of the documentation they found was, as an example, African-American children who were being brought to barber shops for a haircut were charged 2 and 3 times more on a consistent basis. When the state officials would go back to these businesses and ask, why would you charge African-American, particularly children, more? Their response was, Negro hair is thicker and tougher and it dulls our instruments and it's the cost of business. African-Americans would complain that they would go to diners and restaurants in downtown Providence or Pawtucket or Newport, and they were either refused service or they were asked to sit at counters, but not at full restaurant tables. When state investigators would contact these businesses, ask, why would you create this 2-tiered system? Their response was, white patrons, if they see Black people sitting and eating, will not come and dine or will leave earlier. So we're doing this to protect our business interests. So what's important here is that even though we don't have Jim Crow laws of separate and unequal like the South, there are Jim Crow traditions that have been documented as a part of this Fair Employment Report. As I said earlier, it is the Kaiser Walsh Shipyard is a major employer during those war years. And in fact, at the early part of that shipyard, African-American men had equal access to welding jobs and equal access to become tradesmen and members of the unions. By the midpoint of the war and the success of the Kaiser Workyard, several of the southern unions, particularly in Louisiana and South Carolina, got wind that colored men and white men are working side by side in Rhode Island at that shipyard and getting paid the same equal wages. If we let this get out, then there's going to be the same requirement in our shipyards in Charleston, South Carolina, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The National Boilermakers Union came into Rhode Island and restructured the process so that it moved African-American or colored men out of the union and out of the fair wage system and equal opportunity system. The Providence NAACP, led by attorney Joseph LeCount, and they were joined by the National NAACP by a young lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. Who was he? Well, we'll figure out who he is later. Together, they file a class action suit and are successful and not only win the case for equal wages and equal union membership for the African-American Boilermaker unions in Rhode Island, it would set the stage for equal wage and equal membership for all union members across the unions across the country. This historic act did not happen in New York. It did not happen in Boston. It happened in Providence, Rhode Island, led by our own NAACP and our own Joseph LeCount. Later that year, Miss S. Foster Grant, a chairperson of the Urban League and a socialite from the east side of Providence, along with James Williams, led the effort to finally integrate the nursing schools at Rhode Island Hospital. At that time, if you were not a graduate of the nursing school at Rhode Island Hospital, you could not become a certified nurse. Women of color were excluded from being a part of that school. My own mother graduated from Rogers High School in Newport, Rhode Island in 1941. Her husband and three brothers served. One brother died in service to his country in World War II. She wanted to be a nurse, and she was prepared to go to the Brooklyn, New York Nursing College because she knew at that time, as a woman of color, regardless of her interest, her education, her capabilities, it was the color of her skin that was precluding her opportunity to work in her own state, in her own city, in her own profession as a nurse. Fortunately, the Urban League, led by Miss Hunt and James Williams, prevailed, and by the end of 1943, the Nursing School Council of Rhode Island Hospital would also accept women of color as equal access for nursing jobs in Rhode Island. And the outcome of this work by the end of World War II is that the Rhode Island Council for Fair Employment Practices is organized. And in 1947, it is led by Senator John Fitzgerald of Newport, James Williams again of the Providence Urban League, Joseph LeCount, and particularly leadership members of the Providence and Newport branches of the NAACP. By 1949, Rhode Island law is passed to establish a Fair Employment Practices Act that provides specific statements that to foster employment of all individuals in the state in accordance with their full capacities, regardless of race or color or religion. And by the end of 1949, the Rhode Island Commission Against Discrimination is established that provides ongoing enforcement and investigation to protect and preserve the rights of all Rhode Island citizens who should have equal rights and access to fair employment. So now it leads us to the third section, which in my sense is the most important, so that it's very much tied to modern day, present day history of civil rights and the challenges and the ongoing efforts to be secured by African Americans, meaning the 1950s up until the 1990s and present day. In this area, we're going to look at the areas of fair housing and urban redevelopment. By the end of the World War II and the end of the 1940s, the federal government puts forth two very compelling and fairly comprehensive, impactful acts. In 1949, the Federal American Housing Act is this sweeping legislation that allows the establishment of public housing authorities and public redevelopment agencies and provides massive amount of federal dollars to build new public housing to meet the needs of returning veterans, but also to begin to give people an opportunity to remove themselves from the blight and urban decay of some of the ancient and antiquated neighborhoods of urban America. And by the 1950s, by 1956 to be exact, there's a Federal Aid Highway Act that creates an interstate highway system. In our case in Rhode Island, it's 95 and 195 that in theory would allow now the newly returning veterans, their families, the ability to move seamlessly from urban city to the growing suburban areas. These federal policies would significantly shape not only the neighborhoods or the public housing, but the very nature of how people lived, worked, and worshiped within urban enclaves in Providence and across America. The challenge is that the Jim Crow traditions that we faced in the 19th and early 20th century would raise their head up yet again, and we would see this impacting public housing decisions, urban redevelopment decisions, and neighborhood redevelopment decisions. And what's important to recognize is that when we talk about the 1950s into the 1960s, as you can see in my last bullet point, 90% of the non-white minorities of Rhode Island at that time are African American. This is before the major expanse of Latinos and Southeast Asians and other groups. So when we're talking about discrimination of non-whites, it's almost exclusively at that time African Americans, or as we were called at that time, Negro. And it's important that you recognize that as we begin to establish these public housing authorities, these public housing authorities begin to interpret their own rules and regulations of how they should apply access and enjoyment and utilization of public housing. So beyond needing an income test, there are racial tests for integration. In fact, the Providence Housing Authority at that time, not unlike what was going on in Connecticut and Massachusetts, would establish policies that if one Negro was in a development, then it was integrated. Not a family, not a floor, but one Negro. So you could have a new development such as the Roger Williams in South Providence along Thurvers Avenue with hundreds of units, meeting the needs of thousands of families. If one Negro was in that unit, they met the test of integration. So as early as 1950, Urban League President Andrew Bell, yet another giant of civil rights and Black business support in the 20th century Rhode Island, he comes forward and says, this policy of discrimination in Providence public housing, it cannot be done, it cannot be supported, and we will file suit if it continues. Providence Housing Authority comes back and suggests, well, we've got a great idea. Rather than trying to integrate, let's simply build public housing for Blacks alone. And in fact, the Coddington Court project originally was to be designated a Negro-owned project. Andrew Bell and others came back and said, separate and unequal is not what we're looking for. We're looking for equal access and equal choice. And to have a sense of what was going on at that time, I went back and looked at an old saying in the Black community that comes from the South. And it particularly came at the time of the early 20th century as African Americans were migrating from the South into the North. And they were learning that even though they left Jim Crow behind in the South, they were finding Jim Crow traditions still very rooted as they were relocating to places like Providence, New Haven, and New Bedford. And that saying is, in the South, white people don't mind how close a Negro gets to them as long as he doesn't rise too high, meaning economically or socially. But it's in the North, white people don't mind how high you rise as long as you don't get too close. And you see that very much embedded in public housing and housing policies of Providence and in Rhode Island and New England at that time. And in fact, it is a man named Irving J Fame, along with Jewish, Christian, civic, business organizations who come together and form the Citizens for United Fair Housing that decide that we need to have federal legislation that promotes fair housing, not only for the public sector, but for the private sector. I can't tell you how important this work was to be done by Irving Fame and others. As you can see, I have access to reams of news clippings of that time. At the time for the hearing for fair housing, simply asking that we remove any racial test for access to public housing or access to private housing. We just remove a racial test. Let it be based upon the person's economic, social merits. 500 business leaders packed the State House to fight this law. The Providence Board of Realtors, joined by boards of realtors across the state, packed the State House to fight this law. And their simple response is that separate but unequal is better than integration. And they feared that integration would reduce the value of their properties. Their fear, like the barber shop a few years before, that more Black people living side by side or within developments, public and private, would reduce the number of whites. But in any case, despite the fears, despite discrimination, after 8 years of battle, led by Joseph LeCount, led by Irving J Fame, in 1965, Governor John Chafee signed the Rhode Island Fair Housing Practice Law. As a follow-up to the employment law, it specifically stated, no owner having the right to sell, rent, lease, or manage a housing accommodation or an agent of any of these shall directly or indirectly make or cause to be made any written or oral inquiry concerning race, color, and religion. Now I want to talk about urban redevelopment and give you some very specific examples of how the goal of removing blight became the objective of removing communities and families, and particularly families of color. And I'm going to give two examples, the Fox Point neighborhood example and the Lipid Hill neighborhood examples in Providence. Fox Point, as we know, or we should know, is an historic community that is tied to the sea. It's tied to Providence Harbor and Seekonk River. And it has been since the 18th century a major economic vehicle attracting working families, particularly those families that are tied to the fishing and marine industries. By the late 19th and early 20th century, Cape Verdeans are arriving and populating the Fox Point neighborhood. And by the end of the 19th, early 20th century, Fox Point becomes this lifeblood of Cape Verdean and working white, Portuguese, African-American families all joined together because of their orientation to the sea and the marine environment. And one of the things I was able to do, which is interesting, and this is just a tidbit of what I'm able to do, I've gone back into the archives and records, and I'm actually taking present-day Fox Point, and I'm replotting homes and structures that exist today where Cape Verdean men, women, and families once lived in the 20s and 30s and even earlier. And it's been exciting for me to be able to reconstruct a community that was deconstructed because of a variety of circumstances. And these deconstructions came from first the 1938 hurricane. The 1938 hurricane was devastating. It wiped out and deconstructed not only the neighborhood, but a large part of the working waterfront along India Point Park. But by the 1950s, before we see the advent of the interstate highways, Brown University, along with government agencies, city agencies, under the guise of urban redevelopment, were beginning to purchase large tracts of land, raise buildings, and begin to restructure Fox Point to accommodate not a working class community, but now college students and faculty, which would further accelerate gentrification of local residents. And let me be clear, this was going on in Boston, Providence, Newport, New Bedford, New Haven, everywhere. But my point today is to present the devastating consequences of federal, state, public policies had on people of color, and particularly working people in their own neighborhoods. By 1960, I-195 literally dissected a working waterfront in a working neighborhood. And by the end of 1962, the decision is made that India Point Park ceased to being a working waterfront area and more of a passive park area, the area that we have today. And it's the combination of gentrification, the separation of jobs and people from their neighborhoods that devastates the working families, and particularly Cape Verdean families of color in Fox Point. And again, one of the things that I was able to do was to take a 1918 map of Fox Point and overlay on it the 195 highway and also the green area, which is India Point Park. And you'll see on the top right-hand corner, these are the major employment companies that were all employed and working along India Point and Providence Harbor at that time. And many of the men, women, and families that worked at those places lived on Wickham Street, lived on Armstrong Street, Sheldon Street, Brook Street, all those neighborhoods, Transit Street, they were a part of a Fox Point community that's been largely gentrified to this day. I also want to point out the Lipid Hill neighborhood. Again, Lipid Hill, an historic neighborhood in the east side of Providence, has had indigenous people, African Americans, later Cape Verdeans, going back to the 18th and early 19th century. And it would be the Providence Redevelopment Agency that would designate a significant part of Lipid Hill as blighted and come up with an urban renewal plan that would clear nearly 57 acres of largely residential buildings. The devastating consequence of this redevelopment would have significant impact on families who had owned, lived, and operated businesses in Lipid Hill for generations. And again, Andrew Bell, who's one of my heroes, comes forward and suggests, as one could readily guess, and you can read what he says, removing people from one neighborhood and not recognizing that we still have redlining, discriminatory practices of living in real estate in this city, in this state, we're going to end up forcing those families in very little choices. And what we see is many people pushed out of Lipid Hill are now pushed into South Providence and Elmwood. And I want to give you a dramatic sense of what was done with Lipid Hill. And this comes from the City of Providence GIS mapping system. And on the left is a 1952 picture of Lipid Hill. You can see North Main Street right here. This is Only Street. This is Doyle Avenue. This is Camp Street. So all of this housing is pretty dense. Lots and lots of structures and housing. This is Hope High School to give you a sense of where we're at. And then 10 years later, after urban redevelopment, here's that same area, which is Only Street, Camp Street, Doyle Avenue, North Main Street, and Lipid Hill now looks like a wasteland. It looks like someone dropped a nuclear bomb and destroyed every living built thing. And that's exactly what happened to Lipid Hill, that literally dispersed a community, historic structures, and most importantly, people of color who have lived, worked, and worshiped there for generations. It would be Irving Fame, again, coming forward and suggesting that rather than redeveloping anything, we should do something that is historic and meaningful. And again, I want to be clear here. This is a development which today we recognize as University Heights. We shouldn't look at University Heights with 21st century design, development, and use standards. This was unique at its time. Irving Fame's vision was to build a shopping center that everyone would have access to. He also wanted to build housing, which later became the apartments, where everyone would have equal access to, regardless of low income or high income, regardless of race or ethnicity. And his stated goal is that this would be a national model. His interest in doing this is quite extraordinary because Irving J Fame, and I just want to point this out, Joseph LeCount, Mary Elizabeth Jackson, Roberta Dunbar, Andrew Bell, these are all great civil rights leaders, standing side by side with those men and women of Irving J Fame. He's born in Providence. He's probably better recognized as a part of the Fame family in their textile business of Apex. But Irving Fame is also a lifetime member of Temple Bethel. He's a significant contributor to his place of worship, to his community. And he took it upon himself not only to build University Heights, but not only to lead the effort for fair housing. I had the privilege several years ago to interview people who were my mentors, the late Mike Van Leesten, another great champion of civil rights. And they would tell me stories of being young men coming out of college. And in the 1960s, they were looking to go south and register people to vote. Men like George Wiley were looking to raise money and consciousness to deal with poverty and dislocation redevelopment. And every time Irving Fame would quietly, silently, stealthily provide money, provide support to support these efforts. This was a man at the forefront of promoting public housing and fair housing, and in the background, lifting up and supporting Black institutions and Black people all through the 60s until the end of his life in 1970. And I want to end here with what we now call our fair share, which is as we're moving from fair employment to fair housing to weathering the challenges of urban redevelopment, we're now seeing in the 60s this new leadership group led by young men and women who are now very much immersed in the March on Washington, the Civil Rights era under the Martin Luther King era. And you have men and women such as a Mike Van Leesten, who's this brash Rhode Island College student who's organizing Rhode Island College students to march on the State House. He's physically taking the lead in promoting voter rights in the American South. Later, a Mike Van Leesten, along with others, would come together and help organize and establish what today is recognized as the Opportunities Industrialization Center. And it's led by men like Mike Van Leesten, Cliff Montero, who goes on to become a civil rights leader and an NAACP leader in his own right, Arthur Hodge, Mo Adams. These men and women become the nexus of supporting and promoting our fair share, this ongoing battle that exists to this day through a Black Lives Matter movement, our ongoing battle to present and promote civil rights and equal rights for all. And I'll go on a limb and say, for any and all of us who are Americans, or Rhode Island or Providence citizens today, the very basic equal civil rights that we enjoy and many times take for granted stand on the shoulders of African-American citizens of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Men like Mike Van Leesten, B.J. Clanton, George Lima, Izzy Ramos, Rowena Stewart, the list goes on and on. These men and women led the way for each and every one of us to enjoy the luxury of equal rights and equal opportunity. So let me end here with the unfinished business. As we enter the 21st century, as we come through a summer of unparalleled Black Lives Matter and social justice movement, we have to recognize that the challenge of achieving solidarity and opportunity needs to look back into history. We need to look back and listen carefully to the men and women and families who bear witness to the struggle for the equal rights for all. And I'm going to end and suggest, what is the new civil rights movement today going forward in the city of Providence, in the state of Rhode Island, and across America? Well, it's criminal justice reform. It's health equity within the pandemic. It's immigration reform, religious tolerance, illiteracy issues, access to affordable education, and most importantly, economic empowerment and closing the wealth gap that still exists of particularly African and Latino Americans in Rhode Island, in this great state, and in the city of Providence. So thank you for letting me share this information. This is a tip of the iceberg. Working with these historical institutions, we'll be continuing to collect and, most importantly, present this information in databases and online forums. And our goal is to continue to educate and to engage and bring together all Rhode Islanders in the great history of our city of Providence and our great state. So thank you for being patient. I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Okay, we actually have time for only 2 quick questions, and then we'll respond via email. So the first question is a quick one. The picture of the woman soldier in the preceding slide was interesting. Is it Mary E. Jackson? I think they mean the military style uniform.
Yes, Mary E. Jackson's uniform as a part of the YWCA was that uniform, and that was a standard uniform that many women at that time would wear. She was listed as an officer within the War Council. So she played that role and she wore that uniform.
Second question, can you please repeat the info about the KKK and roads on the Patuxent?
The KKK had grown by the early 1920s to over 1,000 dues-paying members of Rhode Island. They were mostly co-located in northern Rhode Island and into eastern Connecticut. But in 1925, they had a membership event where nearly 1,000 people attended at Rhodes on the Patuxent.
Last question. Did the Kaiser Company have one of its early childhood centers for the families who worked in the Kaiser plant in Providence?
That's a great question. We're looking into that because I've had my union friends ask me that same question. I found one instance where there was some level of work share and family share, but that's something for further research, and hopefully we'll be able to answer that question more succinctly.
Finally, I think all the other questions will be answered via email. And do you have the last slide? I think the email addresses will be mailed with the surveys. Thank you.
Keith, you have too much to say. We have to have you back. Thank you. That was outstanding. And we will figure out a way to continue this conversation because the feedback from everyone has been, it's so enlightening what you're sharing. And I know you had more because we talked about that. So Keith, thank you so much. And Sunny in the background. On behalf of all of us at Providence Community Library and everyone attending,